When Texas rancher Garrett Crawford stepped out into the cool evening air of his barn in October 2008, his wife expected him back in minutes. He never returned. The massive search that followed found nothing, as if the vast West Texas desert had simply erased him from existence. For 4 long years, his disappearance remained a haunting cold case. Then, a retired police dog on an afternoon jog began digging frantically at a peculiar spot in the desert, uncovering a bizarre, ritualistic clue that would transform a missing person case into a sinister tale of cartels, desperation, and a secret that cost a man his life. This is the story of that discovery, and the horrifying reason why a good man was forced to make a deal with the devil. To understand the story of Garrett Crawford, you must first understand the land he belonged to. Brewster County, Texas is a place of immense scale and stark, unforgiving beauty. It is a vast expanse of rugged mountains, sprawling desert, and wide-open sky, a landscape that forges a unique kind of person-independent, self-reliant, and deeply connected to the land. For generations, the Crawford family had been a part of this world. Garrett was a third-generation rancher, a man whose identity was woven into the very soil of his property. Ranching here was not just a job, it was a legacy, a sacred trust passed down from his grandfather, who first broke the land, to his father, who built the ranch, to him. But by the 2000s, the world of the independent rancher was under siege. A multi-year crippling drought had turned pastures to dust, and a volatile global market made the economics of raising cattle a constant, heartbreaking struggle. Garrett, a proud and stoic man, was facing the slow, painful death of his family's legacy, a secret desperation that was eating him alive. This part of Texas is also defined by another powerful and often dangerous reality, the border. The Crawford Ranch, like many in the region, was located in the vast, porous frontier between the United States and Mexico. For centuries, this has been a corridor for movement, both legal and illegal. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the nature of that movement changed. Powerful and violent drug cartels began to use these remote, unpatrolled stretches of desert as key corridors for smuggling narcotics into the United States. The sparsely populated ranch lands, with their isolated roads and vast empty spaces, became valuable assets in their logistical chain. This new, dangerous reality introduced an element of paranoia and threat into the quiet lives of the local ranchers, a world of unspoken rules and violent consequences for those who saw too much. It was at the volatile intersection of crushing debt and this dangerous new frontier that Garrett Crawford's story would find its tragic end. The call to the Brewster County Sheriff's Department came in just after 9:00 p.m. on a Tuesday in October 2008. The voice on the line was Sarah Crawford, and it was strained with a tension that was palpable. Her husband, 58-year-old Garrett Crawford, was missing. He had walked out to their main barn 2 hours earlier to check on a rattling sound in his old tractor. He had said, "I'll be right back." As the sun set and plunged the vast landscape into an unnerving darkness, a knot of anxiety tightened in Sarah's stomach. Her calls for him were swallowed by the immense, silent space. A check of his truck revealed his keys sitting on the passenger seat. Garrett never went anywhere without his truck. Something was profoundly wrong. A lone deputy, Rick Ortega, was the first to arrive. The Crawford Ranch was remote, miles down a gravel road. The isolation was absolute. Ortega listened as Sarah and her son, Ben, recounted the evening. They described Garrett as a man of routine, a man who would never just leave. They walked to the barn. The scene was quiet, almost eerily normal. A single bare light bulb illuminated the cluttered but organized space. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no evidence of foul play. The only thing out of place was a heavy wrench, lying on the dirt floor directly beneath the tractor's engine, as if it had been dropped in the middle of a simple task. A man fixing his tractor had simply vanished. The next morning, a massive search was launched. Neighboring ranchers arrived on horseback to help, their deep knowledge of the terrain invaluable. The Texas Rangers, the legendary law enforcement agency, were called in to assist. A helicopter scanned the landscape from above. But the land itself was the greatest adversary. It was a vast, unforgiving world of rock, sand, and thorny brush, a place that could easily hide a secret forever. For days, they searched, fanning out in disciplined lines, combing every gully and rocky outcrop. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single clue. The lead investigator, Detective Miles Corbin, began to dig into Garrett's life. He found what he expected, a man buckling under immense financial pressure. The ranch was on the verge of foreclosure. To Corbin, a veteran detective, this painted a clear, if tragic, picture. It was his primary working hypothesis. Garrett Crawford, a proud man facing the loss of his family's legacy, had finally broken and simply walked away from his life. But one detail didn't fit. While sorting through Garrett's desk, Sarah found an uncashed check from a cattle auction for nearly $18,000. It was a significant sum, enough to keep the bank at bay for a few more months. Why would a man fleeing his debts leave that kind of money behind? It was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, a nagging anomaly in an otherwise straightforward theory. But with no other leads, the case grew cold. The search was suspended, and the file on Garrett Crawford was placed in a cabinet, his story becoming another sad, unsolved mystery of the Texas desert. For 4 long years, the Crawford family lived in a state of suspended grief. The world moved on, but for them, time was frozen on that October evening in 2008. The financial pressures that had haunted Garrett did not vanish with him. They fell like a crushing weight onto his wife, Sarah, and their son, Ben. They fought to save the ranch, selling off cattle and land, piece by piece, to keep the bank at bay. The mystery of Garrett's disappearance settled into the cold, hard geology of an unsolved case, a cautionary tale whispered among local ranchers. The case file grew thick with dust, and then, in the spring of 2012, a retired police dog on a routine jog shattered the silence forever. A woman named Maria Sanchez was jogging a dusty trail several miles from the old Crawford Ranch with her adopted German Shepherd, Buster. Buster was no ordinary pet. He was a retired K-9 officer, formerly trained in human remains detection. Suddenly, Buster stopped dead. His body tensed, and he bolted towards a peculiar cluster of rocks, where he began digging frantically. Maria, knowing his history, felt a cold dread wash over her. She called 911. A young deputy was dispatched, and though skeptical, he noticed that the ground around a large sandstone boulder seemed to have been disturbed. He called for a small forensics team. Using heavy pry bars, the team levered the massive rock aside. It revealed a shallow pit, but the pit did not contain a body. Instead, it held a neatly folded pile of men's clothing, a brown canvas jacket, and a pair of blue jeans. And resting on top, in a bizarre ritualistic arrangement, was the bleached white shell of a large desert tortoise, and duct taped to it was a stained and misshapen cowboy hat. Back at the sheriff's department, the evidence photos were uploaded. When Detective Miles Corbin, now just a year from retirement, saw the images, he felt a jolt of adrenaline. The jacket, the hat, they were familiar. He pulled the dusty, cold case file for Garrett Crawford. The missing person poster showed Garrett leaning against a fence, smiling. He was wearing the same brown jacket. On his head was the same light tan cowboy hat. It was a perfect match. After 4 years of silence, the desert had given up a clue. The Garrett Crawford case was no longer cold. It was now, without a shadow of a doubt, a homicide investigation. But the centerpiece of the crime was the tortoise shell. It was a deliberate, symbolic act that screamed for interpretation. It was Detective Corbin, dredging up a memory from an old Border Task Force briefing, who had the breakthrough. He contacted a DEA liaison, who explained the chilling significance. In the brutal, symbolic language of drug cartels, the turtle or tortoise, an animal that hides in its shell, is a potent symbol. It is used to represent a Soplona snitch, an informant. The killer had not just buried Garrett's clothes. They had branded him as a rat and left a terrifying message for anyone else who might think of talking to the police. This single piece of information was the key that unlocked the entire case. With this new sinister lens, investigators reopened Garrett's financial records. This time, they weren't looking for debt. They were looking for unexplained income, and they found it. Tucked among the legitimate cattle sales were dozens of small, irregular cash deposits, totaling nearly 50, zero in the months before he disappeared. It wasn't ranching income. It was a series of payments. Garrett Crawford hadn't just been in debt. He had been on someone's payroll. The case finally found its path forward in the sprawling, rumor-filled ecosystem of the federal prison system. An inmate named Hector Morales, serving time for drug trafficking, saw a news report about the turtle shell grave. He knew what it meant. Facing another 12 years behind bars, he contacted the district attorney's office. He had information about a murder. In a secure interview room, Morales laid out the entire tragic story. He confirmed that Garrett, desperate to save his ranch, had made a deal with a local cartel cell. The deal was simple. Garrett would allow them to use a remote corner of his barn for the temporary storage of drug shipments coming across the border. In exchange, he received regular cash payments. But the cartel's leader, a ruthless man known as El Martillo, the Hammer, decided to expand from drugs into the more lucrative business of human trafficking. He told Garrett the barn would now be used to hold people. This was a line Garrett Crawford would not cross. He refused and made a fatal mistake. He threatened to go to the police. According to Morales, that threat was a death sentence. Two of El Martillo's men simply waited for Garrett in the barn that night, grabbed him, and forced him into a vehicle. They didn't kill him right away. For several days, they tortured him, trying to force him to sign the deed to his ranch over to their front company. They wanted his land as the ultimate price for his defiance, but Garrett refused to break. When it was clear he would not sign, El Martillo gave the order. They killed him and disposed of his body in a place, Morales said, that would never be found. The elaborate burial of his clothes with the tortoise shell was a separate, calculated act. It was a final, degrading insult and a chilling warning to others. Hector Morales' confession provided the horrifying truth. It explained the cash deposits, the reason for his murder, and the meaning behind the bizarre grave. For the investigators, it was a moment of profound clarity. For Garrett's family, it was confirmation of their deepest fears and their proudest beliefs. They finally learned that Garrett had not been a victim of his own weakness. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake out of desperation, but who, when confronted with true evil, had found a moral line he would not cross. He died not because he was a coward, but because he was, in the end, a man of principle who refused to allow his family's home to be used as a cage for the innocent. While the men who killed him were never brought to trial for that specific crime, Morales' information led federal agents to dismantle the entire cartel cell. Garrett Crawford's unwilling sacrifice had, in a way, saved countless others from the same fate.